Welcome to the Reading for Wellbeing podcast. I'm your host, Professor Pozzulo. Today I'm talking with Dr. Katy Milkman, author of How to Change: The Science of Getting from Where You Are to Where You Want to Be. Welcome, Dr. Milkman. Great to have you here today.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in the idea of behavior change?
Sure. Yeah. I'm a professor at the Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania, and a behavioral scientist by, I guess I was going to say training, but actually my training is a little bit off from that. My PhD is technically in computer science and business. So I came to this field in a little bit of a roundabout manner. My undergraduate degree is also in engineering. And I didn't get interested in behavioral science and frankly even know what it was until I was in my graduate degree program and I was required to take a graduate sequence in microeconomic theory. And I really fell in love with the unit covering behavioral economics, which was kind of a hot new field at the time that was a blend of economics and psychology. And it was essentially saying, let's actually relax some of the assumptions that we typically make about human behavior if we're economists, where we would say people are perfectly rational and optimizing decision makers. And let's allow for the possibility that maybe people are impulsive. Maybe people really dislike losing. Maybe people have some tendencies that deviate from that original model. And I thought, wow, this is fascinating and really truly describes what I'm observing in the world. And I'm really interested in understanding better what are the mistakes people make? How can we fix them? And so I sort of veered off course, started studying what I now study for a living. And on the topic of behavior change specifically, that's not where I started. I mostly started just intrigued by people's mistakes and trying to document them in consequential settings. And it took another few years after my graduate degree until I started studying the science of behavior change. And that was catalyzed by becoming an assistant professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where we have an amazing medical system. We have a medical school here that is just one of the very best in the world. And we have an extraordinary group of people who study medical decision-making over there. And I started wandering over to their seminar series and trying to just learn from these really interesting people studying important applied problems. And I remember vividly one day as an assistant professor sitting in one of these lectures, and someone who was presenting put up a pie chart that changed my life, which is pretty much the nerdiest thing a human can say, I guess, but I'll just own it. I'm a nerd. So the pie chart was a description of the percentage of premature deaths in the United States that were attributable to a range of different causes. And some of these were things that are, I thought of as like the main causes of premature death, things like your environment, your genetics, accidents. These are the kinds of things I think of as like, that's why people die young. But one wedge in the graph in that pie chart was the fraction of premature deaths due to daily decisions that we could change if we wanted to. Things like eating right, exercising regularly, not smoking, not drinking, buckling your seatbelt in the car, etc. Those are the kinds of daily decisions we make that matter. I would have guessed that pie wedge might be 5% of premature deaths, maybe 10%. It seemed important, but a small fraction compared to everything else. And what it showed was that they were 40%. It was actually the largest wedge in the pie chart. And it kind of blew my mind to realize that these daily mistakes we make that I was already kind of casually interested in and studying accumulated in such a meaningful way to change people's life expectancies and to take their lives away early. And as I reflected, I realized, probably my underestimation of how much these things accumulate was true in other contexts as well. Seemed likely that if I was underestimating how much this mattered for longevity, probably these small daily decisions add up more than I appreciated in terms of our educational and career outcomes, in terms of our, ability to save for emergencies and for retirement. And so that realization kind of changed my course of my research. And I have spent roughly the last 15 years, just shy of that, pretty focused on the science of behavior change for good, as opposed to what I was doing before, which is more casually trying to understand human decision making. I've been focusing more on how do we use what we know about human decision making? How can we use the science to improve outcomes in health, education, and savings. And I run a research center along with Angela Duckworth of the University of Pennsylvania that focuses on that goal.
Fantastic. I am so glad you saw that pie chart, and I'm so glad that you decided to get into this area. And I think this won't be a surprise, but I absolutely loved your book, and
Oh, thank you.
yeah, fantastic. I think what really got me was that you made behavior change sound so easy, even if you've failed before. Can you talk a little bit about how people can sort of get started if there's a certain behavior that they want to change, or if they just want to get maybe healthier? Where should people start?
Yeah, it's a great question. By the way, I should say I'm so honored that you loved the book, and I'm glad that it felt approachable. I do want to be careful in saying I don't think behavior change is always easy. I do think that there's good science suggesting it's doable, and it shouldn't feel like moving a mountain. But of course, it depends on what the goal is and what the changes you're trying to make, and sometimes it will feel like moving a mountain, and there aren't quick fixes. So I think that's important to highlight too. I don't want to oversell what is possible. But the first place to start, of course, is setting a goal and figuring out, what is my objective. That goal should ideally be a little bit of a stretch, but not so extreme that it's sort of hopeless. And then ideally, you'd think really in great detail about what is it going to take on a daily and weekly basis, specifically to make progress on that goal. So if your goal is I want to get in shape, okay, that's a fine goal, but it's actually not nearly concrete enough. And you're going to want to think about, well, what does that mean? What is my goal then this week and each week thereafter? How would I get in shape? What does that look like? Does that look like, I'm going to start going to Zumba classes 3 days a week for an hour with a friend? Does it look like, I'm going to get a Stairmaster in my house and I'm going to hop on that before I go to work? Figuring out what's the plan that you're going to use that's more concrete, and sort of what's the frequency at which you're going to engage in a specific behavior that will advance you towards the goal. And then this is so this is so in the weeds, but it matters immensely. When are you going to do it? Where are you going to do it? Those kinds of concrete details turned out to be critically important to nail down in order to make sure you actually follow through on the goals. So these are the first steps. And then we can talk about all the reasons that people might not actually follow through on those plans. But first, you need to make the plans, set those intentions very firmly, be really clear about what I'm going to do when to get to my desired end state. And then, then you can still trip up, and we can talk more about some of the strategies that will help.
Yeah, fascinating. As I say, the book really resonated with me, and the idea of setting very concrete goals makes a lot of sense.
Yes, no, this part is very intuitive, and I should say, I should also cite some of the research that sort of makes it clear why this matters. We have one study that I really love that looked at people who had made a commitment to volunteering 200 hours a year for a wonderful nonprofit. And they were being reminded already by the nonprofit that meant doing a little bit of volunteering each week. And this was really important for the organization to function. And we came in and said, hey, let's just be a lot more concrete and bite-sized about that. We should be saying, 4 hours every week is how you get to 200 hours a year. Give those weekly goals, not only the long term goal. It's the same thing, but we saw about an 8% increase in volunteering when we make those big distant goals more bite-sized, and we're clearer about what do you need to bite off every week, not sort of just a little bit every week. So even doing simple things like the division for people helps them get clearer about what is my objective function right now so that they can make progress on it.
Excellent. You mentioned this concept of nudging in your book. Can you talk a little bit about what nudging is?
Yes, absolutely. So my research has been very much influenced by a research stream that came out of behavioral economics that is about trying to solve problems using insights from psychological science to tackle policy challenges. So the nudge research is about 20 years old. There's a book from 2009 by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, or possibly 2008. I should know the exact year, but roughly that vintage. It's called Nudge, and it introduces the idea that in every environment where we make choices, whether we realize it or not, whether it was intentional or not, the environment is shaping our decisions. And I think the best example, and the one the book opens with, is the example of a cafeteria. That when you walk into a cafeteria and you've got your tray and you're going to go pick out some things to eat for lunch, you're going to find something is presented to you first at the cafeteria, right? Something comes first in the line, something comes last. And whatever comes first is actually a lot more likely to end up on your tray and in your stomach than the very last thing you encounter. Because at this point, even if that appeals, you have to like backtrack, return something, that's just not how we operate. So, what that means is that whether they meant to be or not, the person who decided which food items would be placed where in the cafeteria, they were a choice architect and they were nudging you towards the options at the front of the line, the first thing they presented. And, you could say, oh, shucks, I guess I didn't realize that I was being influenced in that environment. And that person didn't realize it. Maybe we don't want them to have a hand in our eating decisions and they should just back off, but they can't. There's no such thing as a neutral choice architecture. There's no such thing as a nudge-free environment. And so decisions should be made wisely, ideally, about sort of, well, what would most people want to encounter first, and be sort of subtly guided towards what would be the ideal. And in that case, you might say, well, maybe healthier food should be presented earlier. Most people have the goal of being healthier. But the book is really wonderful because it lays out not only this idea that in every environment we face, whether we mean to or not, our decisions are being nudged, meaning shaped by forces that are psychological rather than sort of, a change in price or a change in information. Our environment and the way things are presented, that is shaping our choices with or without our conscious awareness. And ideally, we should use this insight that nudging is everywhere for good. We should be conscious of how every email we receive, every cafeteria layout, every meeting design, every gym layout, these things are changing our decisions, and let's use them for good. And the idea of nudging is one that really is at the heart of a lot of my research. But as Richard Thaler likes to say, like, I mostly study snudging, which I'm glad he didn't tell me to name my book Snudge, because that would have been not a bestseller. But self-nudging is the idea. It's which is really what I study, sort of thinking about how do you structure your environment and how do you set up your choices so that you are putting yourself on the best possible path towards a good outcome, without changing the information you're presenting to yourself necessarily, or like the incentives you encounter, which are hard to self-shape.
That's such a powerful example of how, things that we don't even think about are influencing our behavior and ultimately our well-being, I would say.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about the obstacles that stand in our way when it comes to changing our behavior?
Yes, there are many of them. Some of them are in the external environment. Things like, do I have the financial resources I need? Am I in good enough health to take the steps I need to take? That is not what I study. So I focus on the obstacles that are inside of us, that even if, the world is on our side, sometimes we're our own stumbling block, and we're sort of wired in ways that make sense in aggregate, but can be challenging when it comes to goal pursuit. So some of those internal obstacles that seem to be common challenges are just the challenge of motivating yourself to get started. Sort of, how do you get escape velocity once you have a goal that's on your mind? There's the challenge of our impulsivity, which is that we tend to really favor instant gratification over long-term rewards in the heat of the moment, and that can lead us to make decisions that aren't aligned with our goals. On the flip side of impulsivity is procrastination, that we can put off till tomorrow what we really should do until today because, frankly, of impulsivity. But I think of these as sort of related, but they have slightly different consequences and solutions. We forget a lot. We're very forgetful if things aren't really like in our face, salient, top of mind. If we're not being reminded, we often don't follow through on our best intentions. And so that's another barrier that can stand in the way of doing the things that are good for us. Laziness, which I think many people see as a negative, and of course has some major drawbacks. But I actually, as a computer scientist by training, do think laziness is an asset to a degree, right? Like, all of the best algorithms are lazy. They look for shortcuts and fast solutions and take the path of least resistance. And if you're building good software, it's lazy. And I think it makes sense that the human operating system is also one that looks for shortcuts and tries to take the path of least resistance and builds habits to fall back on. But that can be a barrier to making a change when we have those tendencies to look for shortcuts and easy ways out and habits that we can fall back on. Confidence is another barrier that I think is important to highlight. If we don't believe we can achieve a goal, then it's really much more challenging. And I should say also groups that have faced challenging stereotypes throughout their lives are particularly likely to encounter these kinds of challenges with confidence. So I think that's another one to keep in mind. And then finally, in this sort of it bleeds over a little bit between the internal and the external, but I cover in my book as well and think that it is important to consider is social support and sort of what, are the people around you giving you the message that this is achievable, this is something that people like you ought to and can accomplish, or is your sort of social environment giving you the opposite message and sort of you have some agency there and it can affect your internal state in ways that you might want to be considering to achieve the best outcomes. So those are the big ones that I think about, and that my book is sort of grouped around. Each chapter walks through one of these barriers. And by the way, of course, it's often the case that we encounter multiple barriers and we need to sort of tackle multiple things in order to achieve our goals. But the book and my thinking are really about what are the best interventions or snudges, or what are the best tools we can offer for people for each of these challenges, so that if you see this in yourself, you can think about, okay, well, this is what I need to do in order to overcome impulsivity. And this is how I'm going to conquer forgetting, or, my habits being in my way, and so on.
Yeah, I really enjoyed how your book actually was laid out. And so if there was something that was particularly, I think, impacting your lack of ability or standing in your way, you could focus on that particular chapter. What surprises you about this research? Has there been any findings where you're like, oh, I really didn't see that coming?
Yes, many times. I would say maybe the most extreme is a project I did on habit formation a number of years ago, where we were trying to help employees at Google form gym-going habits. And this is work that was joint with an amazing team, but I should say led by John Bashirs at Harvard Business School. And in this project, we had this theory that habituation, trying to build a habit around gym going or anything else, meditating, toothbrushing, whatever, pick the habit you're trying to build, that you want to be as consistent as possible in the execution and the timing. That was what research, just looking at when people were habituated, how their habits looked, suggested. And so we thought, okay, if people are trying to form a habit, let's see if it's effective to get them to be pretty consistent, like really quite consistent about how they engage in the behavior, in this case, gym going. So we randomly assigned people to different groups. We had thousands of people in the study. All of them wanted to form gym habits of going to the on-site gyms at Google. And they knew this was like a startup mode, that this was around the new year, a program they could sign up for. Then we randomly assigned, some of them got paid for visiting the gym, only if they visited the gym at a time they had planned in advance. So they would tell us sort of, what's the best time for you to form this habit of going to the gym? And they'd maybe say, I aim for 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. to be my workout time. And we'd say, great, okay, you're going to earn money every time you go to the gym between 7 and 9 a.m. for the next month. And if you don't go between 7 and 9 a.m., no money for you. Then we had another group where we also said, what's the best time for you to go to the gym? They also would answer, 7 to 9 a.m. And we say, great, we'll send you reminders at that time. But anytime you go to the gym, you'll earn some money. So try for 7 to 9, but if that doesn't work, money anytime. What we ended up with, because we varied the amount of money we paid and had these different conditions, we ended up with a couple groups of people who went to the gym actually at the same frequency for a month, which was the period of the study, but in different patterns. So some of the people who went were visiting the gym about 90% of the time at the same time, right? Those are the people who got rewards only if they went in that narrow window. Then the other group had visited in a much more varied way. The people who had been rewarded, regardless of when they went, half of their workouts were at that sweet spot and the other half were more all over the place. Okay, so this is sort of the setup for doing the research we wanted to do, which is we're going to see, okay, the program's over, who formed habits that stick? And we had this hypothesis, it's going to be the people who we'd gotten going really consistently. And we were totally wrong. It turned out that the people who had the stickiest habits were actually the people who'd been more variable in when they visited the gym. And we were surprised by this because we had thought, but routinization, that's the key to habit, right? Like do it at the same time every day, isn't it? When we dug into the data, what we found was the following. We found that the people who had been more routinized did indeed, if you only looked at their gym visits during their sort of sweet spot time, they were a bit more habitual. They were a bit more likely to keep showing up at that time than the people who'd been more variable in their attendance. But here's the problem. If they missed their sweet spot time, that was it. They did not go to the gym at other times. They were done. It was, 7 a.m. or bust. If I miss that time, I'm just not going. Whereas the folks who had been rewarded for more variable routines and who had, half the time gone at the sweet spots, sometimes gone after work, sometimes gone in the middle of the day, those people were much more resilient. And if they missed their regular time, they had a high probability of getting to the gym at some other time later. And net that led to a more robust exercise habit. So I thought this was a really interesting study because I think it debunked something that we thought was true, but hadn't collected evidence on, was that you want to be really consistent in the way you build a habit. And it highlighted that actually what you really want to do is avoid being too rigid with yourself when you're trying to form a stable new routine. What you want to do, sure, everybody had come up with the first best time and made a plan and gotten reminders for that time, but building in resilience and actually experimenting and teaching yourself that, if I miss my 7 a.m. workout, I'm still going to try to get there for a noon workout, or I'll have a backup plan of after work. That turned out to be a better strategy for building a stable and lasting routine. And so I think that's an important finding for me. In the book, I talk about sort of the importance of elastic habits. That's how I refer to this more flexible version, sort of more elastic, more flexible. And the rigidity is really harmful when we're trying to do something new. Sort of punishing ourselves for not getting it perfect is going to be a major problem. So that was a surprise to me, and I think an important lesson about how we build sustained behavior change.
For sure. Fascinating. How do you know what strategy might be more useful in one situation or one context over another? Because, as I was reading through your book, different strategies might be more appropriate for certain situations. Do you have any thoughts on how we can sort of figure out what strategies we should try to incorporate?
It's a great question. I think in some cases, it's straightforward enough that we can just sort of interrogate ourselves or whoever's trying to make the change about what are the challenges. So for instance, say you're a doctor seeing a patient who's not taking their medications, the simple things like, do you feel like it's that you're forgetting, or is there a side effect that you dislike? And so it's like a dread, like what's going on there? And there's really different solutions. If it's, I'm forgetting, then we need to get like a system of reminders and maybe somebody else who knows the time you're supposed to take it and who can check in. That's a forgetting problem. That looks really different than an I find it unpleasant. And then it's a problem of, okay, well, now we need to solve for make it feel like less like like whatever the side effect is. Like we need to find a way to counter that, make sure that the long-term outcome is truly rewarding enough and emphasized enough that so different challenges in different settings. Sometimes it's just about talking to yourself or another person about like which of these barriers do we have to surmount. I think other times, though, it's less clear. You're not sure if it's a problem of forgetting, or is it a problem, I find this miserable, or is it a problem of like, I just sort of don't believe I've got it. Maybe it's a little bit of muddled mix of the three if you talk to yourself or to someone else about it. In those cases, I think experimentation is frankly probably the best answer, which I think we underinvest in. And I don't mean experimentation the way scientists do it, right? You don't need to like flip a coin and run an A/B test on yourself, but rather just, trying a few approaches to try to get a sense of like what's working for you. And that itself can help you see which of these strategies will be most useful. Because a lot of them, they're pretty low cost to implement. You may just need to try a few things and see which is leading to the best results. I wish I had a quiz that I could offer, but I actually don't think that this is the right place for such a thing. I think it's a little that would be like over analyzing the situation a bit.
Great. Thank you so much. I now want to turn to a segment we call Our Readers Want to Know. These are questions from our book club members. So, our readers want to know, is there a key strategy for people who want to make healthier healthy choices that will lead to better physical well being versus mental well being?
It's a great question. I don't think that the research points to differences in what will be effective in those contexts because it's not clear that there are different barriers in those contexts, right? For both physical and mental well being, often the challenge is, following through on the activities that science has proven can help you. For instance, if we're thinking about physical well being, that might be, getting regular exercise and, if there's any medications you need to take for chronic illnesses, taking those medications, eating healthily, those are kind of the physical, well, getting your sleep. Mental well-being, by the way, has overlap, right? Of course, physical activity, sleep, and maybe social connections. These are some of the things that matter most there. So actually some of the actions and activities are going to be overlapping, but it's still largely about, well, okay, but then how do you get yourself to do that? That's sort of what my work is all about. And one of the strategies that I want to mention that I think is very useful and pretty universally applicable for mental health and physical health, and that we haven't talked about yet, is trying to find a way to make it feel less like a chore to do these things that are good for you so that you actually enjoy them and you look forward to it instead of dreading it. And that can be choosing activities differently, right? The way you exercise doesn't have to be on a maximally punishing Stairmaster in your basement. It can be, going for walks with a friend. It can be hitting the gym while binge watching your favorite TV show. It can be, playing tennis or some other sport that you find you really enjoy. There's lots of paths, and I've written about the specific strategy of temptation bundling, which is if it feels like a chore, but there's something you really love, can you only let yourself enjoy that temptation while you're pursuing the chore? So this would be the example, for instance, binge watching favorite TV shows while at the gym, or only letting yourself listen to a favorite podcast while you're cooking a fresh meal for your family, or maybe open a fresh special bottle of wine on those occasions. So thinking about how do we make it fun can be pretty universally applicable to both of those things, and tends to be a strategy people overlook.
And I just want to add in that it's actually my personal favorite strategy. And so, I was really pleased to see that in the book.
My favorite too, personally, and one I use whenever I can.
Yeah. How do you know if you're ready to make a change?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, the first thing I'll say is, like, if you're listening to this and feeling motivated and like, oh, maybe I want to get that book, that if there's a goal that you are excited to pursue that's a little different, that's like a really good sign that you're ready to make a change. I think we think about when we look at the literature on what's the path to change, what does it look like? You can think about the first stage as one that I actually don't cover in my research or my book at all, which is a stage of persuasion. And that may be self-persuasion or other persuasion, just convincing someone this is a good idea. And all of my research picks up after that and says, like, yeah, the person or you are convinced, I would like to get in shape, or I would like to save more, or I would like to learn Spanish, or, whatever that goal is. The goal is clear to you. And the question now is, how do I get there? So I think if you already have the clarity that you want to do something differently, you're ready. You're ready to make a change. And if you don't, then, you probably shouldn't read my book, and this podcast may not be as productive. Then you may need to be thinking about, like, you're in the stage of persuasion. You may want to interrogate whether there is something that you want to change. And by the way, I would say it's rare that I encounter a person who has nothing they want to change, right? This is part of the reason New Year's resolutions are so popular, that we all kind of know that we're not perfect, and we aren't. We're human. And there's always some way in which we're trying to improve. And sort of, I think there's some quotes that are quite wonderful by famous literary figures, to the extent of the sort of, if you're not still striving to be better at something, like, are you even human? That's the whole purpose. Like, there's, so I think most of us have reached the point where we're ready to make some kind of change. It doesn't have to be dramatic. But if not, then you're in that persuasion mode. Or if there's a person you'd like to see make a change and they're not ready, then you're in a persuasion mode. And then there's a whole different research literature for thinking about, well, how would we bring someone to the table and get them excited about change?
Thank you so much. Last question from our readers. What role does willpower have to play in, behavior change and, reaching your goal?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, ideally, it plays very little role because when we have to fall back on willpower, things don't go well. There's a lot of misconceptions about this. People think like, oh, the people who achieve the most in life and who have the best habits. When I look at them, they have so much willpower. And there's really wonderful research that my collaborator Angela Duckworth co-authored, showing that actually, while we have that conception, it's a misconception. And the people who we're looking at and saying like, wow, they've really got everything together, it's mostly that they've built habits and routines and are not relying on willpower. It's the people who have to rely on willpower because they don't have habits to fall back on who you see struggling. Because if your solution is like, I will just convince myself to eat healthily and resist the temptation, or I will convince myself each day to find a way to exercise, they really struggle. It's like you've built routines, you've taken the friction away, you have a path that's clear, you set the goal, and you're not relying on willpower. You're just following following the path of least resistance. Like, I'm signed up for Zumba class with my friend and we'll meet there. And of course, I don't even have to think about it. I'm not exerting willpower. It's on my calendar. I would be disappointing someone. I'm looking forward to it. I've got a commute situation set up, like I'll be there. That's where you want to be in terms of follow through. Is just, it's pretty frictionless and enjoyable, and there's no internal struggle that you're facing. As soon as that internal struggle comes into play, you've set yourself up for failure.
Thank you. This podcast is related to the Wellbeing Book Club. So I have to ask, what are you reading these days? Any recommendations to our listeners and our readers?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. So I will tell you right now, I'm reading fiction because I spend so much of time at work reading nonfiction. So on my bedside or night table next to my bed is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. So, I think the New York Times put out a list of the 100 best books of the century, and that was at the top, both of the readers' list and near the top of the critics' list. I was like, time to pick up this book. So that is what I am in the middle of. And it is a tough read, but it's wonderful. And tough, I say, because I cried a lot. Like, it's heart-wrenching. But highly recommend that. I'm a big fan of fiction. But if you're looking for nonfiction recommendations, I have plenty of those too. One of the most fun things actually that's come out of life post writing a book is getting early manuscripts from friends and being invited to blurb them and getting to see the incredible work that my peers do coming out in form that's really meant for a general audience. A couple of my favorites that I'd highly recommend on this topic of behavior change, in addition to Nudge, which we already talked about. So Nudge is at the top of my list, but also Cassie McGilner-Holmes at UCLA wrote a fabulous book called Happier Hour that I really love. And Eilert Fishbach at the University of Chicago wrote a fantastic book called Get It Done, both on related themes to behavior change, but with a different take and sort of a slightly different focus. And I think those are two of the best. I also really love Charles Duhigg's new book, Super Communicators, that came out earlier this year, if you're looking for how to have better conversations. So those are a few nonfiction recs too.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I just want to say Happier Hour actually was my pick in September. So,
wonderful taste. Yeah. I'm so glad you already got your book club members reading it. It's just terrific.
Yeah. And I'm just watching the time. So I'll say final thought. Can you give us your final thoughts on how to achieve successful behavior change or build those long-lasting habits that can improve well-being?
I would say don't try to do it alone. Do it with support. Try to do it in a way that you enjoy, and try to use the science, because we really have learned a tremendous amount. And I think you can set yourself up for a much greater probability of success if, instead of just trying to invent your own strategies, you look to the ones that have a basis in evidence as you're trying to build a plan to succeed. So those would be my final takeaways.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The book is How to Change the Science of Getting from Where You Are to Where You Want to Be by Dr. Katy Milkman. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
We hope you have been enjoying the Reading for Wellbeing podcast. If you would like to become a member of the Reading for Wellbeing Book Club, follow the link in the description. If you're passionate about evidence-based information on health and wellness, don't forget to tell your friends and join us by subscribing to the channel. Happy listening and happy reading. Bye for now.